BBC Radio 3, it's 7:30. Now, as part of our Fairest Isle season, Adrian Jack concludes his exploration of the historical, architectural and musical heritage of English cathedrals, choral foundations. This week he visits Durham.
Durham Cathedral occupies one of the great natural sights of England. It sits astride a rocky wooded peninsula in a bend of the River Wear. And that is a weir right by where I'm sitting on the opposite bank. The castle on one side and the monastic buildings on the other form a jagged outline like a citadel. The castle protected the neck of the peninsula from the Scots. In medieval times, the bishop had royal powers, with the right to raise an army and issue his own coinage. The castle was his main residence until the university was founded in 1805, when a community of monks from Lindisfarne, off the wild coast of Northumberland, found a refuge here from the constant threat of Danish invasion. They brought with them the body of St Cuthbert. Later, the remains of the Venerable Bede were also buried here. Bede's resting place is the extraordinary Galilee Chapel, which replaces any kind of entrance at the west front. It's one of Durham's unique architectural features. At the other end of the cathedral, the vast Gothic Chapel of the Nine Altars forms an eastern transept, which rises to the full height of the choir, and its uncompromising, austere facade confronts the other side of the peninsula. But Durham is predominantly a Norman building, and what most people come to see is the colossal Norman nave and choir, with its stone-ribbed vault, first erected in the final decade of the 11th century, and the earliest of its kind anywhere in Europe. Durham is one of the greatest Romanesque churches ever built, and certainly the finest in this country. The outside is rugged and plain. It hardly needs to be otherwise because of its commanding position. Inside, the cathedral has an unexpectedly warm atmosphere, partly because of the rich oatmeal colour of the sandstone, and partly because of the generous roundness of its immense pillars and the bold emphasis of its carved decoration.
protection it may be free from all adversities, and devoutly given to serve thee in good works, to the glory of thy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. O God, from whom all holy desires, all good counsels, and all just works do proceed, give unto thy servants that peace which the world cannot give, that both our hearts may be set to obey thy commandments, and also that by thee we, being defended from the fear of our enemies, may pass our time in rest and quietness, through the merits of Jesus Christ our Saviour. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night. For the love of thy only Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ.
Durham Cathedral is on the edge of a ravine, so it has no entrance in the west front. And the main entrance is the north portal, and that's where I'm standing with Canon Stephen Pedley, my guide round the building. Stephen, you have a title, Custos Puerorum. Now, what does that mean?
I'm guardian of the children, and basically I have the care of the choristers. I'm the human face between the dean and chapter and the chorister school.
The north portal is a very impressive Norman structure with rounded arch, and the chamfers are alternately moulded and carved with zigzag. Then there are cushion capitals and pilasters. The stone is a very orange colour. It's like rich sand on the beach, but it's very, very badly weathered. It's crumbling away, and in certain parts you can even put your fist inside the wall. And there's also an interesting marbled effect, which seems to be emphasized the more weathered the stone is. Stephen, aren't you worried about this situation?
It's a continual cause of anxiety indeed. The stone all comes from within about 2 miles of the cathedral. So when the church was being built, the quarries are on the river banks, and presumably the stone must have been brought down by barge and then brought up the ravine and built here. The walls, of course, were much thicker once upon a time, with the result that the exterior of the cathedral had a much deeper and more sculptural effect. But at the end of the 18th century, the architect at the time felt that the best way to deal with the erosion was simply to cut further back into the stone. The building is under constant review, and we know exactly where we've got to be working on it in 50 years' time. But yes, you're right, the erosion is pretty deep. You've talked about the North Portal. It's not the original North Portal. It's all part of the 18th century, late 18th century rebuild. It was a much bigger portal originally and had above it the little room where the 2 monks sat, interviewing those who came seeking sanctuary.
And on the door itself, there's an enormous knocker in the form of a beast's head, although the nose is quite human. And it's got ears sticking up, a bit like a fox's ears. And then it's got a sort of sunburst, like a ruff, round its neck. And the knocker itself is the handle which is suspended from its teeth. But why do you need a knocker on a cathedral door?
Well, it's a marvellous survival, of course, from the Romanesque period. The theory of sanctuary was that provided you, if you, whatever you had done or hadn't done, if you were on the run, provided you got here and grasped the great handle of the knocker, then that was a sign of your serious intent, and you'd knock on it and shout loudly, and the 2 monks upstairs would come down, and if they felt that you were a worthy cause, they would then house you for 25 days, I think it was. Sometimes I feel we ought to put candles behind those dark eyes, and it would frighten us at the depths of night if we approached it.
The nave of Durham is truly an awesome sight. It's not tremendously long. It consists of 8 bays, if you count the westernmost Tower Bay. But what is so impressive are the massive columns which alternate between round pillars, which are decorated with deep carvings, and composite piers. The composite piers carry shafts which go all the way up past the triforium to the springing points of the arches across the stone vault, which is ribbed and also carved with zigzag ornament. At the eastern end of the nave, the arch across is rounded. But if you look at the arches springing from the compound piers in the middle of the nave, they are pointed. Why is that so, Stephen?
The original architect, in order to be able to build so high and so wide, and using that great round arch at the crossing, in order to establish the rest of his design, the only answer technically was the pointed arches which you've just spoken about. Lots of people come, of course, and say this is the sort of vocabulary of Gothic architecture. Whether it was a self-conscious Gothic pointed arch or not, it's still a wonderful thing to behold. And the height of it being about 70 feet off the ground, the length of the nave being about 200 feet. It's a wonderful vault, and it stood here for 870 years. Never before had so vast a space been covered by so impressive a vault.
The rounded columns of the arcade have different decoration. The easternmost columns have a diamond pattern. The next round columns have a very bold chevron or zigzag ornament. And then the next columns are fluted, rather like classical columns. Stephen, how was the carving of the rounded columns done?
The thought is the actual work was done in the yard and then brought into the cathedral and put in place here. It's estimated, incidentally, that a labour force of about 700 and 800 masons were needed over the course of the building of this construction at any one time. So the peninsula upon which the cathedral stands, which was a monastery, of course, was a hive of great activity, a much busier place in many ways then than it is now. The columns, of course, we can't see at the moment are those ahead of us at the east end of the church and the choir, which are the great spiral columns. And that was the architectural language at the beginning of the 12th century, marking a particularly holy or important sanctuary, the place of St Cuthbert, so that pilgrims would recognize that, yes, these spiral columns denoted a very special and holy place. Having completed the east end, presumably the designer said to the carvers, well, do what you like in the nave. You've done terribly well with your spiral columns. I'll give you a freer hand. And so the lozenge, the chevron, the fluted columns that you've talked about, a riot of excitement and creativity.
The westernmost point of Durham Cathedral is occupied by a unique building called the Galilee Chapel. It's a rectangular space, and it consists of 5 aisles separated by a total of 16 rounded arches, which are vigorously carved with zigzag. They look almost like something in Saracen Spain. Underneath there are water-leaf capitals, and then there are very slender shafts, very slender columns, 4 in each group. But Stephen, what is a Galilee chapel?
A Galilee chapel was built at the west end of many churches. It had a liturgical function. It was a chapel where a mass was celebrated, first of all by pilgrims, before they went into the main church, reminding the monks and the monastic community who lived here for 450 years of our Lord's appearances in Galilee after the resurrection. It was also known from the very beginning as a lady chapel. The first vision was in fact of a new extension at the east end, and they didn't get very far with that because they did make mistakes, these builders, and they didn't put proper foundations. So Hugh de Preces, who was the bishop at the time, decided that instead of having another shot at the other end, he would build at the west end, here where we're standing. Of course, before this was built, the great door that we're looking at was in fact the original west entry into the church.
That's where the altar is.
That's where the chantry chapel is to Cardinal Langley, who very largely redesigned this room in the 15th century. But I guess that if we had come in the 12th century to Durham, before the Galilee was built, we'd have gone in through that great west door and not through the north door. Who knows?
On the north side of that doorway, Stephen, there are wall paintings. Are they original to the building?
Yes, they are. The altar we're looking at there on the north side was dedicated to Our Lady of Pity. On either side of the alcove behind the altar are the remains of 2 12th century figures, one of St Cuthbert, which is almost complete, dressed as a 12th century bishop. He didn't probably look like that at all. And on the other side, of course, facing Cuthbert, the rather defaced figure now of Oswald, king and martyr, who was Cuthbert's great champion and friend.
The Galilee Chapel is also the resting place of the Venerable Bede, and there's a large black tomb. It's rather like a black marble slab. Stephen, are his remains still there?
Yes, they are. Bede is one of the great heroes of the northeast of England. He was a historian, he was a mathematician, he was a great astronomer, he was a biblical scholar. He was a Renaissance man, right at the center of the Northumbrian Renaissance of the 8th century. And it's amazing to think that he spent his life between what is now Sunderland and Jarrow, was the heir to a wonderful library which the abbots of the great monasteries of the northeast had collected. So he read everything that was available and mastered all the sort of knowledge that was current at the time. It's because of Bede that we know the early history of the English people and the English nation and church. If it hadn't been for Bede's scholarship, we wouldn't know really very much about the life of St Cuthbert, who's our other hero. And at the height of the Middle Ages, people came in vast numbers, as much for Bede as they did for Cuthbert, and his shrine, which survived like Cuthbert's until the Reformation, was a wonderful glittering creation and was the focus of a lot of prayer and a lot of pilgrimage.
Towards the west end of the nave of Durham Cathedral stands the font underneath a rather extraordinary, almost monstrous erection. It's carved of very dark wood. It's almost like a market cross because there's a circle of columns which are classical at the bottom, and then there's another stage with more columns and Gothic style arches, and then there's the same again, even higher, and then a little crocketed pinnacle. Well, it's not so little, a crocketed pinnacle with an eagle on the top.
It's a dove.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's a dove symbolizing the sacrament of baptism. This baldacchino stands above the font, and the font is the place of baptism, and the baptism of Christ, the Holy Spirit descended upon the Christ in the form of a dove, and so it's very definitely a dove and not an eagle. The Commonwealth left this church in a terrible state of disarray, and it had been used as a barracks for soldiers. They wintered here on their way from Scotland to London and so on. They destroyed all the woodwork that was around and did a great deal of damage to the whole building. We were lucky at Durham because the first bishop, after the restoration, you know, when we were able to dance again and sing again and enjoy ourselves, was John Cousin. And he wanted to restore something of the beauty of holiness to the building, to recapture something of the richness of its medieval atmosphere. He spent a lot of money on the east end of the cathedral at the choir. He also spent a lot of money on the west end of the cathedral by highlighting the place of baptism. The white marble font itself underneath this great canopy is really quite a small and simple design, in contrast to this great towering thing that towers above us to about 25 or 30 feet.
And in the south aisle, by the side of the font, stands an organ which looks roughly from the same period. It looks 17th century. It has very richly carved dark woodwork and gold pipes. Splendid looking thing.
We have to remember as we look up the nave that the open vista that we see now is relatively speaking a late development, is a late 18th century development. Originally, before that date, there was a great screen, and over that stood that great organ that we see over there now. That screen was pulled down in the 18th century as part of the 18th century restorations, and the original organ case was brought to the back of the church. And behind it's a cupboard. If you want to find a broom, that's the place to look.
Stay
Stephen Pedley has brought me through the cloister at Durham, and then through the chapter house and into a tiny little barrel-vaulted stone chamber, which people don't usually see. In fact, not many people can get inside here. It's a prison, Stephen, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There are two prisons here. This is the smaller of the two. The monastic community in the 11th century lived here before the present cathedral was built. And this little room that we're standing in comes from that earlier period. It's just about the earliest room of the 11th century that we have here. It adjoins the chapter house. Every day the community would meet in the chapter house. They would read a chapter from their foundation document, the Rulers and Benedict. They would then do any necessary business, administration of one kind or another. And then if one of the brothers had committed some misdemeanor, sworn at somebody in a dinner, or had done something the others disapproved of, then he would admit to his guilt at the chapter meeting. And if it was a relatively minor offence, he would have been put on water and bread, I suppose, here in this little prison. If he had murdered a brother, or something really serious, then he would have gone to the other prison, which is a much more unpleasant and unsavoury place, actually cut out of the rock itself on the peninsula.
Well, at least you can stand up in this little room, so it's a relatively comfortable prison.
Yes, I'd like you to try it, though, for 24 hours.
Stephen and I have come into the monk's kitchen at Durham Cathedral. It's an extraordinary octagonal stone building, and by the way, the hum in the background is the heating system for somewhere else. It's the most extraordinary vaulted roof with very strong ribs which cross over each other and support a kind of lantern. I suppose that was the chimney, was it?
It was. That wouldn't have been concreted over originally. The ribs crisscross one another in a kind of exotic, almost oriental feel. It was used, incidentally, as a kitchen until about 1920. And what was originally the prior's house at the Reformation became the dean's house, the deanery, and that's at some considerable distance from here. And food was cooked here and carried on great trays to the deanery dining room. In its heyday, it was, of course, the kitchen for the monastic community, which we have to remember lived here for 450 years. At its height was a community of 70 to 80 monks, not to mention all the staff that they employed. And in the days before the National Health Service, we have to remember that these great Benedictine houses were the nearest things that came to be centres of welfare. And on certain great feast days in the annual calendar, literally thousands would arrive at the great gate of the abbey to receive their pittance, a bit of bread, a bit of fish, a bit of meat, to keep them going. So a lot of welfare and a lot of hospitality exercised from where we're standing now.
Of
Stephen and I are standing at the crossing of Durham Cathedral, and we're looking up inside the central tower at the stone star vault, but that isn't the complete height of the tower, Stephen.
No, above that is a ringing chamber, and above that is a belfry with 10 bells. The central tower has had quite a history. It was originally much lower. Then a decent tower was built in the middle of the Middle Ages. That was struck by lightning and then eventually rebuilt. And then right at the end of the Middle Ages, the final tower reached the state that it's in now.
So talking about the 15th century.
Yes, right at the end of the 15th century. The north of England, well, Yorkshire particularly, were building great towers at that period, and they were all trying to outdo one another. Interestingly enough, as you travel around the vicinity of the city here in Durham, if it hadn't been for the little cap that they put on at the end of the 15th century, you wouldn't have known that the cathedral was here until you really got quite close. It's astonishing now, because of those final 30 feet or so, that now you can see the cathedral from a very wide radius indeed.
The choir is separated from the crossing by a very impressive-looking marble screen.
You've called it the crossing. It used to be referred to as the Great Alley. We have to remember that the interior of this church was a number of quite separate spaces. Behind us to the west was the Pilgrim's Church, and at the head of the nave would have been the great rood screen with a great altar in front of it, so making the nave quite separate. To the east of us was the great pulpit and screen marking off the monks' choir. And in between was the great alley sort of connecting the two parts. But now, of course, as you're right, we refer to it as the crossing.
And going back to the screen, which is now a rood screen with a cross on top of it, it consists of 3 arches, and you can see right the way through them. They don't block the view to the choir in the east end at all. And they are supported on slender, black mottled marble piers, and then all the work above is a sort of honey-coloured marble with very intricate designs. This was the work of Sir George Gilbert Scott, Stephen.
Yes, it was. Some people love it, some people dislike it. I love it enormously because I think it brings an element of richness to an otherwise austere interior. Sir Gilbert Scott did a great deal of work here. He was responsible for the wonderful pulpit, which is a copy of an Italian pulpit. It picks up all the colours that you've already hinted and mentioned. On the other side is the great lectern, which is a Victorian copy of a late medieval lectern. It's a very handsome brass piece, covered and encrusted with semi-precious jewels, and at the bottom at its base some rather wonderful sphinx-like creatures. This is the part of the church where I remind people of the Victorian investment in the building, because without any doubt, okay, the Victorians did a great deal of damage, but they got more sensitive as they learnt more. But if they hadn't invested time and energy and interest and money in our great churches, they would not have survived in the way that they do for us now.
Stephen Pedley and I are now in the choir at Durham Cathedral. There are 5 bays, and the easternmost bay here is actually from the 13th century.
Yes, it is.
It's Gothic. It has something like a ferocity about it. The arches are very pointed. They don't curve continuously from the capitals. They begin at a sharp angle, which is quite unusual.
And they're covered with a profusion of sculpture, in marked contrast to the rest of the building.
The vault, Stephen, was rebuilt.
Yes, in the 13th century, the vault was in a very dicey state, and when the new eastern extension was built, they decided to revault the choir as well. The original vault, though, would have been very similar to the nave vault.
And it was the first ribbed vault.
It was the first ribbed vault.
The choir stalls are Bishop Cousin's work from the 17th century, and they're very elaborately carved, dark wood, with canopies, spires and crockets, which look quite medieval in style. And if we turn eastwards and look at the stone reredos screen behind the high altar, it's very similar, but that is actually medieval.
This is a late 14th century reredos screen. It's a wonderful piece of work. It's called the Neville screen because it was the gift of the Neville family, who were great patrons and great power in the northeast.
The screen has an extraordinary effect of the vertical. The motion is all straight upwards. It's almost like icicles in reverse. And through the spaces we can see the easternmost lancet windows, and above them an enormous rose window. And the colour of the stonework of the screen is very pale grey.
The screen was designed in the King's workshops, the royal workshops in London. It was carved there, it was boxed there, and then brought by ship and landed on the at Newcastle or Gateshead, and then in its boxes brought from Gateshead to Durham, and then put together like a child putting together a piece of Lego, and put together on site here. In addition to what we see now, the gaps would have been filled by statues standing on those pedestals that survive. There were 107 statues in all. In the middle was the Virgin holding the Christ child, and then on either side of her, St Cuthbert and St Oswald. The story is that these were hidden at the Reformation and somewhere, sometime, are waiting to be rediscovered. Now, what we would do with them if we found 107 mint medieval statues, I don't know.
Now Stephen and I have come to the far east end, behind the high altar of Durham Cathedral. We've actually dropped about 3 feet, several steps down, and we're in the chapel of the Nine Altars. This is altogether an unexpected space. It suddenly seems to open out. It's vast. Chapel is a misleading word because this is an immense area.
It's a great eastern transept.
The nine altars are arranged along the entire length of the east wall, and they form 3 bays at the north end, 3 bays at the south end, with enormous lancet windows above them. But the 3 bays in the middle are treated as one unit, again with 3 lancets, but an enormous rose window with stained glass inside it above those lancets. And these bays are marked off by immense shafts of black mottled marble. What sort of marble is this, Stephen?
The marble is Frosterley marble. It's the northeast's answer to Purbeck marble from the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset. It comes from quarries in Frosterley, which is about 25 miles from here, in Weardale, not far from Stanford. The Chapel of the Nine Altars was built at the end of the 13th century for a number of different reasons. So many were coming to the shrine of St Cuthbert, and it was contained within the old original Romanesque apse of the cathedral, and therefore people management was very difficult. And this provided a lot more space for the movement of people around the shrine. Secondly, it was built because more of the monks in the 13th century wanted to be priests, and therefore there was the need for more altars. Thirdly, it was built because the vault over the choir was beginning to disintegrate, and so a great new building program was needed to replace that. And fourthly and finally, the Gothic style was exploding all over Western Europe, and Durham wanted to be a part of that explosion. The bishop at the time was translated from the See of Salisbury, so he brought architects and ideas, including, of course, the ideas for these great marble columns, not using the Purbeck of Salisbury, but the Frosterley of the northeast. He also brought sculptors from the Angel Choir at Lincoln, and you will see the great bosses in the ceiling above us. They are in great circles, they're great ringlets, and they are in fact intertwined angels. So it's almost certain that they reflect the angels of the Angel Choir of Lincoln. So in this great eastern transept came the very latest in terms of sculpture and architecture. And for 10 years, this was the frontier building in England.
Behind the Neville screen in Durham Cathedral, there's a small enclosed space, and this area is known as the Ferretry because it's the final resting place of the saint we've heard so much about, St Cuthbert. And there's a large rectangular black stone slab in the floor with his name there.
Cuthbert is the reason for this great church's existence, and if you like, you can see it as a great stone tent built to protect his shrine, his resting place, and to protect the monastic community who were the guardians of the shrine. Cuthbert was brought to Durham 1,000 years ago in the year 995. His first resting place wasn't exactly here, but in the first little wattle and daub church that was built to protect him. And then in the year 1104, the east end of this current cathedral was sufficiently advanced to allow him to be translated, that was the term, to be translated from his former resting place to here. The slabs around the black marble slab in the centre here are all that remain of the medieval shrine. It was a great edifice. It must have stood very high. Possibly the coffin of Cuthbert would have rested on top of the shrine so the pilgrims could have seen it from the other end of the church. The shrine would have been encrusted with semi-precious and precious jewels. There would have been all sorts of pilgrims' tokens left here, the crutches of the sick and so on and so forth. And here that all survived until the Reformation, when in 1539 the shrine was demolished.
What did Cuthbert do exactly to make him so revered, such an important saint?
He was a very holy man whose humanity in a pretty barbaric and savage culture was a remarkable and valued thing. He was a great leader of men. He was a great father of the monastic community at Lindisfarne. And then he was asked by Oswald to be Bishop of the Northumbrians. And for 2 intensive years, he evangelized the northeast. He was very much a person who came alongside the people to whom he ministered. He was their friend and the companion and their bishop. The more that was demanded of him, the more he wanted to become a recluse. And of course he died in his little sanctuary on the Farne Islands. But it was his holiness, the fact that people loved him and he loved people, that was in such great contrast to anything else that they experienced, that left this profound impression on them. He is the clue to the spirituality and character of this place. And there is something about the grit and courage of his character that still lives for us, and which continues to be a tremendous inspiration for us, and which still draws people in their thousands from all the corners of the world.
You
bells of Durham Cathedral pealing from the lofty central tower before Matins on Sunday morning. I was shown round the Cathedral Church of Christ and Blessed Mary the Virgin by Canon Stephen Pedley. All the music was sung by Durham Cathedral Choir, directed by James Lancelot and accompanied by the assistant organists Keith Wright and Ian Shaw. The programme opened with the prayers and responses set by William Smith. He was baptised in Durham in 1603, and he died there in 1645. He served in the cathedral first as a chorister, then as sacrist, and finally as a precentor. Thou, O God, art praised in Zion, which we heard next, was written by Francis Grier for the 900th anniversary of the cathedral in 1993. Then we heard a 5-part anthem by Richard Nicholson, O Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem. Nicholson was possibly a chorister at Durham during the late 16th century, but he spent most of his life in Oxford, where he was in charge of the choristers at Magdalen College, and he also filled the position which is now the professorship. In our own time, the composer John Cascomb is professor at Manchester. Until 1993, he taught at Durham University, and he composed his anthem Sun Rising for James Lancelot and the Cathedral Choir. Richard Lloyd was organist of Durham Cathedral from 1974 to 1985, and we heard his anthem The Windows, which sets a poem by George Herbert. Then came the anthem Behold Now Praise the Lord by a Durham chorister in the 1580s, William Wright. After that, the choir sang Psalm 66, O be joyful in God, all ye lands, to a chant by Lindsay Gray. He was a lay clerk here in the 1970s, and he based his chant on the chimes of the cathedral clock. Next, we heard one of the most popular settings of the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, from the service in C by Stanford. At Durham, the tradition of singing Plainchant remains strong, and we heard part of a hymn, the Gradual from the Mass for the Feast of the Deposition of Blessed Cuthbert, according to the rite of Durham Cathedral. It was probably written in 1104, the year St Cuthbert's body was translated from the old Saxon cathedral to the magnificent new Norman building. The final piece of music was written only a few years ago. John Tavener's Ikon of St Cuthbert was commissioned by the Dean and Chapter for the 1300th anniversary of the saint's death in 1987.
Choral Foundations was presented by Adrian Jack, and the producer was Tim Thorne, and that programme was the last in the series.